Come and listen to a story about a man named Jed. He was a poor mountaineer who barely kept his family fed with the meager offerings of the rocky hillsides. And then one day, while he was out hunting and shooting at some food to put in the family pot, a strange thing happened. Up through the ground, right where his bullet struck, came a bubbling crude.
Oil, that is.
Black gold.
Texas tea.
Well, the first thing you know, old Jed is a millionaire. The kinfolk came from all around to marvel at the sight, and they said, "Jed, move away from there." They said that California is the place you ought to be. So they loaded up the old family truck and removed the family from the mountains to Beverly.
Hills, that is.
Swimming pools. Movie stars. The Beverly Hillbillies. On a bright afternoon in their grand new neighborhood, Jethro de Bodine came marching into the mansion with a strange, pompous stride. He threw his arms wide and declared in a booming voice, "Oinks and tally-ho, my liege. Sir Junco de Bodine, at thy service." Jed Clampett looked up from his chair, completely bewildered by the spectacle, and asked what had gotten into the boy, and what kind of strange get-up he had gotten into. Jethro puffed out his chest and explained that this was the kind of royal raiment he was going to be wearing over at the castle. Jed blinked, scratching his head, and repeated, "Eh, what?" Ellie Mae entered the room just then, her eyes wide with excitement as she asked if Mr. Drysdale had called. She told her father that he had inherited a doggone castle over to England. Jed told her to go on, unable to believe his ears. Jethro nodded vigorously, confirming that it was true, describing it as one of those great big rascals with a moat and a drawstring. Granny walked into the room, looking skeptical, and asked Jed if he was agreeing with Jethro. Jed shook his head, saying no, sir. Jethro then explained that he had been over at the bank when Mr. Drysdale got the word, so he immediately went over to the movie studio and got them some Queen Elizabeth clothes. Jed looked confused and asked about Queen Elizabeth. Jethro proudly answered that yes, sir, she was a Queen of England, and he had looked her up in a book, so these were the kind of clothes a person had to wear around her. Granny asked if anybody had to wear them, and Jethro clarified that it was just for us royal folks, adding that the specific outfit he held was once worn by Francis Drake. Granny looked at the velvet garment, turned up her nose, and said well, she hoped it looked better on her. Jethro corrected her quickly, stating that Francis Drake was a man, a fighting man, and a sailor. Granny snorted and muttered that any sailor running around like that had better be a fighting man. Just then, Miss Jane Hathaway walked through the front door, looking for the head of the household.
"Jed?
Have you seen?" "Oh, excuse me, ma'am," Jethro interrupted, bowing low with a grand sweep of his arm. "I did not know that you—" Miss Jane started, but Jethro cut her off, introducing himself as Sir Jethro, the head Bartlett to His Majesty the Earl of Clampton. Jed frowned, telling the boy his name was just Jed, and asking what all this foolishness was about. Jethro turned to Miss Jane with an air of immense superiority and told her that she must not call him Jed, because he was royalty now, and she was just a commoner, one of his oaths. He insisted that she had to bow and scrape and grumble in front of him, and in front of Jethro too, because he was the royal nephew. Granny, losing her patience, stepped forward and told Jethro to give her that piece of leather he was holding. Jethro cowered slightly, crying out for Jed not to let Granny hit the boy. He looked at Miss Jane and asked if she could believe a commoner would hit him, declaring that he would have her thrown in the dungeon like that, because oaths do not run around hitting members of the royal family. Granny shook her head, muttering, no, sir, no, no. Jethro backed away, warning her that now she had done it, and she should just wait until the Queen heard about this, because she had laid her hands on his royal person. Granny pointed a finger at him and shouted that if he did not get his royal person into some decent clothes, she was going to lay more than hands on him. Jed stepped between them to keep the peace, explaining that the boy was just excited because he got a hold of some story about him inheriting a castle, so they ought to listen to what he had to say. Granny folded her arms, declaring that she was not going to listen to any nut that runs around in velvet bloomers and wears a woman hat. Jethro defended his wardrobe, saying these here were royal raiment, and this was what the Queen favored for her nuts. Granny snapped back that what the Queen slept in was her own business. Miss Jane, trying to find her bearings in the chaos, looked around and said, Miss Clousey, I just found him. Jethro turned to Miss Jane, entirely misinterpreting her presence, and asked if that was her, calling her Miss Newtonberry, his royal maid. He commanded her to bend her knee to his highness next to kin, calling her a Saxon dog. Granny glared at Jethro and asked what he had just called her. Jethro sighed, asking Granny when she was going to get it through her peasant head that she did not have royal blood like them. Jed intervened, telling Jethro to hold on. But Jethro insisted, saying, "But Uncle Jed, it is true, I mean sire." He pointed at Granny and said she was just his mother-in-law, and she was not blood-kindier like Ellie Mae and himself. He concluded that this made her a vassal, meaning she had to do their bidding and walk 3 paces behind them. Jed shook his head and said that was complete nonsense. Surprisingly, Granny smiled tightly and said no, that was all right, Jed, and she did not mind walking behind Jethro. Jethro beamed, remarking that such cooperation was more like it, calling her Maeve. He envisioned their grand future, saying that when they stretch around the castle, she would bring up the rear. Granny, without warning, raised her hand and delivered a swift smack. She then asked Jethro if that was bringing up enough, or if he wanted another one. Ellie Mae came running back into the room, asking what Mr. Drysdale had said. Granny answered that he was on his way over, and it seemed Jed had truly inherited himself a castle. Jethro jumped up, shouting, "See? I told you." He urged everybody to hurry and get into their royal ring, stepping aside to let Jed pass, saying, "After you, old man." Meanwhile, at the bank, Milburn Drysdale was pacing his office in a state of absolute euphoria. "Oh, this is fabulous," he muttered to himself, completely consumed by greed and ambition. Fabulous. I can see it now. The presentation to court, being knighted, securing a seat in the House of Lords, having luncheon with the Prime Minister, and sharing tea with the Queen. Miss Jane, standing nearby with a clipboard, looked worried and noted that Mr. Clampett was hardly prepared for such immense honors. Mr. Drysdale laughed off her concern, clarifying that he was not talking about Jed, he was talking about himself. He declared that he would handle things just like he did here, meaning the Clampetts would stay at the castle, while he would be up in London receiving the honors and banking the money. Miss Jane asked what money he was referring to, and Mr. Drysdale gleefully explained it would come from the tenants who lived on the 10,000 acres surrounding the castle. However, Miss Jane cautioned him not to get his hopes up too high, warning that if she knew Mr. Clampett, he might decide not to go to England at all. Mr. Drysdale stopped in his tracks, asking what she meant by that. He insisted that Jed had to go because he had to go, declaring that England was his kind of country, and that was where he wanted to live. Miss Jane raised an eyebrow and asked what would happen if his wife, Mrs. Drysdale, did not want to go. Mr. Drysdale scoffed, asking if she really thought there was a chance of that, but then reconsidered, saying he should not tell her not to get his hopes up. Miss Jane reminded him that the way of royalty was not the way of the Clampetts, as they were plain, simple country people with no such grand desires. Back at the mansion, the front door rattled. Jethro, still dressed in his velvet costume, shouted that this could help. Granny walked out, yelling for the peasants to be quiet because the commoners were here. Ellie Mae twirled around in a heavy, ornate gown, asking how they liked her castle dress and if it was not pretty. Miss Jane, who had just arrived at the house ahead of Mr. Drysdale, murmured that it was beautiful, yes, but noted that people only do not wear that sort of thing anymore. Jethro ignored her, shouting for the commoners to be quiet. He complained that, doggone it, when you hear someone knocking at the door, you are supposed to let down the door string. He then turned to Miss Jane and asked how a person goes about house-breaking an oath. Miss Jane stared at him, repeating, "An oath?" Jethro explained that he had got her oath's clothes and everything, but she simply would not grovel where shucks. Granny marched into the living room, completely fed up, and told the oath to come on in here. She explained to the group that Jethro had been telling her that if she did not grovel, the Queen was going to throw her in the Tower of London and feed her to the beef eaters. Miss Jane gasped, declaring that such an idea was absolutely preposterous. Jethro pointed at Miss Jane, telling Granny, "See? I told you." Miss Jane quickly corrected him, saying no, she meant the opposite. She explained that she could see there was a general misunderstanding about modern-day England, which she intended to clarify, without further ado. She looked at Granny and assured her that there was no such thing anymore, that Granny was not an oath, and she told Jethro that even members of the peerage no longer had the power to rule the lives of others. Turning to Ellie Mae, she explained that those costumes were strictly for pageantry, and she assured everyone that there was no desert prison and no torture for those who happened to be overdrawn at the bank. Mr. Drysdale, who had just walked in and caught the end of her speech, glared at his secretary and snapped, "Will you stop putting England down?" Granny looked hopeful and asked if that meant the Queen was not going to feed her to the beef eaters. Miss Jane smiled and said of course not. Jethro, feeling his royal authority slipping away, turned on Miss Jane in a rage, shouting, "Why you?" He declared that Miss Jane had committed high treason against the crown and had cited an oath, warning her that her head was going to roll. Granny stepped in front of Miss Jane, telling Jethro he had better hang on to his own head too. Jethro backed away, shouting for Granny not to touch him, or else the royal executioner would lop off her offended memory, loudly proclaiming that he was the head baller to His Majesty, the Earl of Clampett. Miss Jane sighed, looking around the room, and asked where the Earl actually was. Jethro pointed toward the stairs, explaining that he was up in the turret putting on his royal arraignment. Upstairs, Jed was staring at himself in a massive mirror, wearing a ridiculous medieval outfit complete with a feathered hat. Ellie Mae called out from the hallway, saying, "Hey, Pa, we got company." Jethro ran up behind her, correcting her by saying no, not like that. He knocked on the door and announced, "By your leave, sir, 2 vassals beseech your audience." Jed called out through the door, stating firmly that he was not coming down wearing those fancy duds. Mr. Drysdale pleaded from the bottom of the stairs, calling out, "Oh, please, Mr. Clampett, I mean your lordship, grant us a boon. We humbly petition your royal presence." Jethro coaxed his uncle, saying, "Yeah, come on." Jed finally relented, saying, "Thanks, Pa," to Jethro's dramatic bowing. As Jed stepped out onto the landing, he muttered that well, all right, but made it clear this was not his idea. Jethro cheered, shouting, "Hot dog, now you're going to see some class. All hail His Majesty, Earl of Clampett." He then nudged Granny, commanding her to kneel. "Oaf." Jethro repeated, "Yes, kneel, oaf." Jed shook his head, saying no, completely embarrassed by the entire display. Later that afternoon, Mr. Drysdale was privately berating Miss Jane in the hallway. He accused her of trying to ruin his life, wreck his career, and shatter his dream. He complained that he had got the Clampetts all steamed up to go to England and claim their castle, and she had destroyed everything with her big mouth. Miss Jane defended herself, asking if he was seriously raving about the fact that all she did was tell the truth. Mr. Drysdale confirmed that yes, that was exactly what he was raving about. Miss Jane pleaded with him to be reasonable, pointing out that while he would be comfortable in London in his accounting house, those poor simple hill folk would suddenly find themselves cast adrift in a society so steeped in tradition and so rigid with protocol that they would be completely lost. She argued they would not know what to do or say, or who to turn to for help. Mr. Drysdale smiled smugly and replied that they would turn to Lady Jane Hathaway, asking who else could possibly guide them. Miss Jane blinked in surprise, repeating, "Lady Jane Hathaway?
Me?"
Mr. Drysdale nodded, addressing her as such. Miss Jane protested, reminding him that she was just plain Jane Hathaway. Mr. Drysdale dismissed her modesty, asking if she truly thought the crown would overlook her services in converting the peasants of Possum Ridge into the keepers of Clampett Castle. Miss Jane laughed nervously, saying that this was ridiculous and she could never expect such a title. Mr. Drysdale then asked if she had not told him before that her ancestors were English. Miss Jane admitted that, well, yes, her great-grandfather and her ancestors were indeed from there. Mr. Drysdale slapped his hands together, exclaiming, "Ah, blood will tell." He told her that she belonged in the castle, raising an imaginary glass to the man of honor, Lady Jane Hathaway of Hathaway Hall. Miss Jane repeated the name, utterly enchanted by the sound of it, whispering, Hathaway Hall. Downstairs, Jed was talking with Granny and Ellie Mae. He looked toward the door and said, Mr. Gray, do you?
Before turning back to his family.
He stated firmly that he thought they had better pass on this going to England business because they simply did not belong in any castle. Mr. Drysdale, overhearing this, rushed into the room, begging Jed not to say that. He promised them that they would absolutely love Hathaway Hall and Clampett Castle. Miss Jane, still daydreaming, accidentally muttered, You said. Before catching herself, Mr. Drysdale shot her a look and whispered fiercely, Oh, Chief, change your mind. He then turned back to Jed, claiming that Miss Jane simply did not have the complete picture before. Miss Jane joined in, agreeing that she did feel Jed should investigate the situation, suggesting that he might find that he would thoroughly enjoy the English country life. Jed scratched his chin thoughtfully and remarked that it was a place in the country, wasn't it? Mr. Drysdale beamed, confirming that, oh, yes, the castle sat right in the middle of 10,000 acres. Jed nodded, thinking that would have to be a heap of land to work. Mr. Drysdale quickly corrected him, explaining that, oh, they did not have to work the land at all. Jed looked concerned, saying they certainly could not depend on Granny because she got her back up by being old.